Very much. I'm not going to talk about football at all, and having done it for 10 years, you don't know how happy that makes me. Hopefully, I think it will probably make some of you happy as well, but it's off the agenda. My biggest, I suppose, reason for being here now is that I'm a complete geek. I got my first computer when I was 7, a Commodore 64, and basically watched as computers got ever more interesting and I got slightly less good at using them. And now I'm basically somebody who is, as you can tell, wearing cords. I'm basically a bit like the kind of Hoxton dad who thinks they've still got something important to say about modern popular music, whilst not really realising that it's just for the kids, as it always has been. My same attitude permeates my knowledge of technology. I'm not a technologist, I don't work in technology co-ops, but I'm someone who's been fascinated by what technology can bring to the ethical values which have animated my life, and I'm also a complete geek, so I probably know a little bit more than the average person, but not as much as someone who really knows what they're talking about, which is a way of saying that's my get out clause for if you think I'm talking tendentious nonsense. So you could have a conference on nearly every one of these words. If you're a deconstructionist, obviously you can have a huge 2-day conference at the MLA on the word but most of us could, that was for Dan Welsh in the house, you can definitely have a debate about what do we mean by cooperative, what do we mean by an alternative, and just what do we mean by capitalism. I'm going to short-cut all of that and say that in terms of totalising ways in which we get from here to there, I'm very suspicious of them in general, and I'm certainly very suspicious that we can actually plan them out in an afternoon. I take David Graeber's point that none of the Florentine merchants who invented what we later came to know as modern capitalism sat down and said, let's create this thing called modern capitalism. They just did some things which made life better for them, and things happened afterwards. And I'm much more of an evolutionarist than a revolutionist in that respect. My definition of capitalism is essentially the Judge Louis Brandeis definition, that ultimately, whatever else it is, it's a political project, not an economic project. It's a political project which takes power from the many and leaves it in the hands of the few, and justifies that through various economic mechanisms, and uses its political power to reinforce that power through its control of economic mechanisms. So, democracy is its greatest enemy. This was a Supreme Court judge of the United States in the 1920s, one of absolutely fantastic guy called Judge Louis Brandeis. I thoroughly recommend you look up his quotes and you realise how appallingly tepid the modern American political discourse is when you see what he used to say in his opinions from the Supreme Court bench. But this is where cooperation has its greatest ability to be the alternative to capitalism, if it is a capitalism of a political project, because cooperation, if it means anything to me, it means democracy, it means democratic control. This is its biggest power, its biggest potential to change the world in which we live. However, Peter Couchman, some of you will know Peter, he's the chief executive of the Plunkett Foundation, who work with rural social enterprise and cooperatives. And I saw him give a talk, and he said, Ian MacDonald, again, some of you might know Ian as a Canadian academic of cooperatives, was commissioned to do a piece of research, which was to look at what were co-ops talking about at every decade in the 20th century? What were they talking about in their annual reports and chairpersons' addresses in the 1900s, in 1910, in 1920, expecting to see an ebb and flow of the century's concerns. So in 1920, they will be all talking about cooperation is the way to get peace on earth after the slaughter of the First World War. What he found actually was that every decade was exactly the same story. At the end of every decade, 2 messages came out from the cooperative movement. The last 10 years have been the crappiest in human history, and this is the moment for cooperatives to come forward and change everything. And yet here we are in 2013. So we're all aware of how cooperatives could be that alternative, but I think we've perhaps been a little bit too full of wishful thinking about how this might happen. So I want to be a lot more critical of the cooperative movement and say some things about what will stop us being anything like an alternative unless we get our act together. And they are, of course, my own personal views, and they do not represent any organisation which I may or may not be affiliated with. There are some things going for co-ops as they address this challenge. We have the new means to do democracy more meaningfully, by which I basically mean liquid democracy and other things which can do participation by many people in a non-chronologically synchronous, doing things at different times in different places, but we're all basically doing the same thing together. We have new means to democratise capital investment. It's quite an interesting statistic I read recently that the dream of the working class of Western Europe and America was to have pension funds which would see you through retirement. And it's noticeable that in the 1970s, as these pension funds acquire the enormous heft, that we see the appearance of the notion of shareholder value as a political driving force in the USA, as essentially pension fund managers start to become the people who sack workers in order to justify workers' own pensions. Because what we didn't do was democratise capital, we just basically collectivised it in that respect. So we have, through crowdfunding, the mechanisms to do democratic capital allocation in a way that we've never had before. This is very powerful. And the final one, it's really hard being an activist because you've got to put a bloody roof over your head. You've got to eat. And it's quite hard to be standing outside the system while still actually buying coffee, as many critics on the right will accuse anybody at Occupy for being a disgraceful turncoat for having the temerity to want something which isn't crap to drink in the morning to get your blood going. Cooperation by addressing basic human needs like housing, like food, actually is a way to do alternatives to neoliberalism which put roofs over your head, food on your table and money in your pocket. So that's something which gives it an opportunity above and beyond other alternatives. But here's the real challenge. Think of a co-op which used the web to be dead good. I'm really, really struggling. Think of a co-op that's used the possibilities of technology which are now available to implement the democratic member control of the enterprise in a way which feels like the sort of thing which you'd say, you've totally got this. You've totally used the tools of today and tomorrow to take the values which have animated our movement throughout history to give it the richness which we now can. And I think there are several problems here that we've basically missed the entire internet revolution insofar as it actually matters. And if you think technology will have a role to play in this future of a non-neoliberal capitalist world, that's a really, really big problem. Not just for that challenge, but also for cooperation itself. On a really basic level, we talk about democratic member control, but the turnout in a great many consumer cooperative societies is risible to the point where you wouldn't really actually talk about it. I mentioned to my wife what the turnout was in the cooperative group, and she laughed at me and said, basically, how dare you go on about being democratic member controlled when 97% of those members are not part of that democratic member control. They are opting out of it by not voting. In unconferences, there's a thing called the law of 2 feet. If you don't like what you're hearing, get up and go somewhere else. Our members have essentially got up and gone somewhere else as far as being involved in that participation. And that should really, really worry us. I think some of the reasons are generational. And there's also a failure to understand the nature of what's been going on, which is the sort of thing Nick's been talking about. I'm a big believer in what Clay Shirky writes about. Essentially, the internet is the great unbundler. Ronald Coase, who's an economist who died a couple of weeks ago, wrote a very influential essay in 1935 called The Theory of the Firm. And he basically says, things come together because it's just too much hassle to negotiate all the sodding time. It's easier to have people in-house who can just fix the loos, who can do this job here and that job there, subject to essentially to top-down dictatorial control. What the internet does is enables that entire premise to be completely rewritten and reconfigured. Everywhere there is a business sector which is struggling in the face of the internet, it's because it's being unbundled. And if you don't believe me, if you watch iPlayer, you are unbundling the very notion of what a television channel is. Television is not something you watch what a scheduler has said. You sit down at 7, you watch this, then you watch that, and then it's the news at 9. Now you can just watch what program you want, when you want, and none of the things you don't want. That's unbundling, and it completely reimagines the economics of television production. And it's happening at pretty much every industry. And I fear that the cooperative movement as a whole has failed to consider how this actually impacts upon it. And a surefire thing that if you're not considering how the internet will kill your business, then you're probably putting yourself up earlier to be killed before other people. Sorry to be down. There is an upside. Bear with me. Here's the biggest problem. What would Charles Howarth do? Those of you who know your Rochdale pioneers would know that Charles Howarth was one of those Rochdale pioneers. He was a Chartist. He got sick of waiting for for politicians to implement the world he'd like to see, where people would have votes, and decided with his colleagues in Rochdale to create the Rochdale Equitable Pioneers Society, which would provide decent food for decent people at decent prices. But would he do that now? Or would he just join Groupon to get flour at a better price? Would he set up what Karl Marx called the second best reading library in the whole of the United Kingdom after the British Library? Or would he just use a wiki? Or would he use a book sharing system which is based on a peer-to-peer sharing network to get better use out of the individual books, whilst basically saying ownership doesn't matter that much? Would they look at providing food through buying it from Manchester at the market and bringing it back 10 miles? Or would they set up something like Incredible Edible, where you just use the space around you to grow stuff in the spaces in between? In other words, I think there's an increasingly radical disjuncture between the cooperative movement's self-image as the movement which is on the side of social change and the impression of the cooperative movement for what problem solvers actively involved in social change actually think of it. Those of you who've read Paul Mason's fantastic book, Why It's Kicking Off Everywhere, will know that he sets up this idea of the graduate without a future, who looks at the ranks of bureaucracy in politics, in economics, in the media, and basically says, I don't recognise you. As Morrissey so said, it says nothing to me about my life. And the next bit is Burn Down the Disco, which is why it's kicking off everywhere. I fear that the cooperative movement sees itself as an organisation at the back of the Occupy protesters saying, you go for it. Whereas I fear the Occupy protesters are looking at the cooperative movement and saying, you're part of the sodding problem too, mate. And that is the disjuncture we have to get past, that we're not automatically on the side of change in the way that we once were, because we're basically not at the pitch of the ball. Gross oversimplification. Klaxon. I just find it interesting, just as a thought experiment. You might remember when Facebook were not privatised, because we never owned it, when they were floated, when Mark Zuckerberg went and mugged lots of people for being stupid. There was an idea that since Facebook is ultimately selling us, why don't we own it? Facebook is a perfect co-op. And I thought, there is the issue. Facebook should be a co-op. We should all own it. And then I thought, yeah, it's so never going to be a co-op. Partly because open source networks are a bit kinky. They don't feel like the kind of vanilla kind of stuff people might like to do, because open source is just a little bit out there, in the same way as I posit there that anarchist horizontalism, which is absolutely part of the solution to the top-down problem of political organisation, feels like a bit of a commitment. Oscar Wilde famously said, the trouble with socialism is it takes too many evenings. And perhaps anarchist horizontalism takes every bloody day and weekends too, whilst you formulate your consensus mechanisms. So I feel this is tendentious Klaxon again, if the tyranny of structurelessness, which I won't bore you with, but if tyranny of structurelessness is the inherent limit of horizontal organisation, and the iron law of oligopoly is the problem with verticalist political integration, maybe the solution is somewhere between, which in my really limited geometric mind is diagonal as opposed to horizontal or vertical. And then I started to think, wouldn't it be brilliant, instead of horizontalist organisations or vertical ones, we could have diagonal organisations? And, a few glasses of wine later, you've completely revolutionised the world. So I think that's what I mean by a diagonalist organisation. The trouble is, what I'd love to say now, and I know some people who are doing this right now, but I don't. But I do know that if an organisation which basically allowed us to come in and out of deliberation, which basically said you either have to choose, do you want to be one of the people who become leaders, because most vertical organisations work on the assumption that we hope that those who are most inclined to offer themselves for election are also the people who know the most about this issue and have the best characters for this. Anybody who's ever been a member of any committee will know that that sadly cannot be relied upon. But again, the horizontalist thing basically says we can all be part of it all the time, and sometimes we just want to watch EastEnders. So this is where liquid democracy, I think, has something to offer, because it's based on the idea that you can make power transparent, and power doesn't need to be this thing which you give to somebody and they wear it until you seize it off them, but it's a process where you can see where it flows. This is the GitHub idea that essentially nobody's in control of open source software development. You don't have to be involved in every part of it, but if you see something going wrong, you can jump in. If you see something going in the direction you'd like to, you can jump in. And this way of organisation is working at scale, and it's not anything reflected in the way we do our cooperative organisation or our political organisation. So, are we basically in the dinosaur preservation society or the mammal advancement business? The difference between the two, obviously, is who could adapt best to the changing circumstances, which is to say, are we Frank Bigelow, the man who was dead on arrival when he arrived at the police station to report his own murder? Or are we Tandy Newton in Mission Impossible 2, Nia Nordhoff Hall, who was injected with the virus, which she managed to get the cure because Tom Cruise is a fantastic guy. So are cooperatives going to be able to inoculate themselves with Bellerophon, the cure to this problem, or have they been given the virus of their own destruction and they just don't realise it yet? The answer will be for the future to answer, but it won't happen unless we're completely wide-eyed about the imminent danger to our entire movement, unless we can start to look like the people who Occupy want us to look like. Thank you.